In the world of destruction of evil, the Axis, Allies, and USSR all fight in a three-way war, where Germany and Japan would end up being nuked, and the death toll would pass 100 million. But before we find out who won, we need to figure out how this all even started. History up to 1936 had no changes, but starting now, there would be some differences. Germany was ramping up their army, industry, and technology quickly. They would remilitarize the Rhineland, something that was strictly prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles. But the Allies, Britain and France, wouldn't do anything about it. After this, the Germans would just walk into Austria and annex it. In Czechoslovakia, the Germans were like, "Give me the Sudetenland." And then Czechoslovakia was like, "No." So the Germans went to the UK and were like, "Give me the Sudetenland." And the British were like, "Okay." So the Germans took the Sudetenland. In Lithuania, the Germans would bully the Lithuanians to give them Memel. And to be fair, they were about to be eaten up by the Soviets anyway. Back in Czechoslovakia, the Germans would hit them with a surprise invasion. Sadly for the Czechs and Slovakians, they stood no chance against one of the best armies in the world. So they would surrender. Slovakia would be set as a puppet. At this point, the Allies were getting pretty mad. They noticed the Germans were going to invade the Polish next, so they guaranteed the independence of Poland, meaning they would protect Poland against anybody who would invade them. Meanwhile, in the background, the Germans and Soviets would start to become good buddies. They would both agree on hating the Polish. Germany and the USSR would publicly announce the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, kind of like an alliance, but not really. Secretly, the two nations would also agree to divide up Poland, even if the Allies are protecting them. Talking about the Allies, they were now very on edge. This new semi-alliance between Germany and the Soviets was no joke. Many leaders in France and Britain would truly believe they were working together against the Allies. And just to make it worse, British spies would get wrong information, making the Allies think that the Soviets, Germans, and Italians were about to announce a new alliance named the Axis all together.
You stupid!
But either way, things were about to go down. In September of 1939, Germany and the USSR would invade Poland. The Allies would declare war on the Germans, and the Germans only. Poland would be like, "Dude, what the heck?" The Allies promised to help Poland defend from anybody, but the Allies only declared war on Germany, not the Soviets. Poland would capitulate sooner or later. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, nothing was happening. Then, out of nowhere, the Soviets would declare war on the Finnish, starting the Winter War. At this point, the Allies have had enough. They were certain that the Soviets and Germans were working together to invade Europe, and the Allies couldn't let that happen. The Allies would declare war on the Soviet Union. Now, this was super uncalled for. Nobody was expecting this, especially the USA. The Americans would see this as a pretty unnecessary escalation. They became more hesitant about sending aid to the British and French. In Scandinavia, the Allies would go to Norway and Sweden and would be like, "Can we please go through your land to help out Finland in their war? Maybe along the way, take control of all your iron fields." And Norway and Sweden went, "Sure, why not?" The Allies would send their troops through those countries and into Finland. They would help on the front lines against Russia, actually fighting the Soviets. The Soviets' progress in Finland wasn't going well at all, but that was about to change. In Germany, Hitler realized what the Allies were doing in Scandinavia. I mean, he couldn't just let them take control of Germany's main iron supply. It was a super important resource. So Germany would cook up a quick plan to get their trades back. They would march into Denmark, then up into Norway, landing at key spots and cities to stop any Norwegian army from organizing. In Finland, the Allies realized what was happening. They were getting trapped. The British and French would quickly leave Finland and hop on boats back to mainland Europe. This would leave the Finnish pretty unorganized at some spots where the Allies filled in, letting the Soviets advance pretty far, more far than in our timeline. Eventually, the Finnish would sue for peace, losing some land. And in Norway, the Germans would capitulate the country, keeping their iron in check. After this pretty embarrassing failure, Chamberlain resigned. Churchill would follow in his place. The British public opinion about this war tanked after the situation in Finland. So in order to make it up, Churchill would order Operation Pike. The UK would bomb Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus, destroying multiple large oil reserves as well. The operation would aim to weaken the Soviets, but also destroy any possible oil imports the Germans have in this area. And by the way, I want to make it clear that the USSR and Germany are not allies. Sure, they have a clear common enemy, but they still aren't buddies and aren't working together against the Allies. It's like two separate wars. Out of nowhere, Germany would invade the Benelux. The British and French would send their troops to defend their northern flank, but the Germans would be too quick. The Netherlands and Luxembourg would immediately capitulate. Meanwhile, the Belgians would fall back. Luckily for the Germans, the French would leave a tiny weak point in their defense. Germany would blitz through the defenses and would trap over 400,000 Allied soldiers. The British would rescue thousands and thousands of their soldiers, but ultimately Germany would capture over 200,000 soldiers. After that, France would have no way of defending. Germany would breeze through, capturing Paris, and eventually forcing France to surrender and become a puppet. Italy would join right after the fall of France. In Africa, Italy would attempt to push the British in Egypt. It wouldn't go so well, so Hitler would tell Italy to stop it. Germany also wanted to take Egypt, but there was something more important. Hitler thought if he could secure the Mediterranean by taking Gibraltar, the British would surrender, and so the Germans would send Spain an ultimatum. It would go something like this. Either join the Axis or, get invaded. And Republican Spain was like, heck no. So the Germans invaded Spain. They were super weak from their devastating civil war earlier. Germany would implement a new Spanish puppet, like Vichy France. Portugal would be the next to join the Axis. Germany basically forced them to do it. Since Hitler was pretty paranoid, the British might try to invade from there. But hey, at least Portugal got some cool land in the north. And about Gibraltar, it would be pretty easy to take, but it still wouldn't make the British surrender. In Africa, many French colonies would revolt against Vichy France and would ally with the British once again. On the Soviet front, the USSR would kind of just ignore the fact that they were at war with the Allies. They would try multiple times to make peace with the British, but they would just deny it every single time. So the Soviets just went on their own side quests. They would annex the Baltics, parts of Romania, and would even try their luck in an invasion of Persia, which would go horribly. Persia would immediately join the Allies and would get help from the British Raj in Australia. The Soviets would decide to just play defense in the mountains, truly regretting their invasion of Persia. Hey Greece, look out! Out of nowhere, the Italians would invade the Greeks, but sadly for them, the Greeks would actually manage to hold their own, even pushing into Albania.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
Germany would see this and would be like, bruh. First, they would go to Hungary and Romania and would be like, join us or, get invaded. And they would be like, sure. Next, Germany would go to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and would say the same thing. Bulgaria would join them, Yugoslavia would be invaded. After that, Germany would invade Greece with Italy, securing the Balkans. In Iran, progress would be slowly made from both sides. The Soviets would invade a little bit more of Iran, even encircling Tehran for a short time. But ultimately, they wouldn't be able to break the defenses in the city. Meanwhile, the British would continue their bombing of oil fields in the Caucasus, especially in Baku. In Europe, rebellions in the Axis were starting to pop up in large numbers. In Spain and Yugoslavia, rebellious forces would rise against the Nazi occupation. Fighting would be brutal on both fronts. Spanish progress would actually be pretty good in the south, but Germany would quickly send some divisions to crush it. Still, the rebellions would continue. Hey, Soviet Union, look out! The Axis would begin their invasion of the Soviet Union, another surprise attack. With over 3 million men, they would rush into Soviet lands, encircling large numbers in Kyiv, Minsk, and Riga. This would completely turn everything upside down. The Allies would finally realize that the Germans and Soviets were not working together. But it was already too late to ask for peace with either side. The Soviets were far from ready for something like this. They would quickly gather an army of around 5 million and place them on the front lines. But they were of little use. The Axis had better technology and weapons, better generals, and simply a better army in general. The Finns would join after seeing the success in the first month of the war, providing another front for the Axis while also betraying the Allies. Ukraine and the Baltics would be completely taken by now. Leningrad would be put under a brutal siege. Meanwhile, the Germans would continue inching toward Moscow. But right before the Germans could take even more land, their worst nightmare happened: the winter. So they decided to dig in and play defense for a little bit. In North Africa, Italy's advance was going pretty good. Then it got bad. The Germans would be like, Italy, you kind of suck, and would send a few more divisions to hold Africa. In Iran, the Allies would begin to slowly advance, pushing the Soviets fully out of Iran, and even a little into modern-day Azerbaijan. Now here's something I know you're all wondering about. Where's Japan? And well, the answer is kind of boring. Japan would do the exact same things they did in our universe up to this point. They would invade China, take French Indochina, build a big navy, etc., as well as attack Pearl Harbor. The United States would be forced to join the war, declaring war on Japan, then getting declared war on by Germany. Japan would go on a rampage. They would invade Hong Kong and the Philippines. They would make Thailand join them so they could invade Burma, Malaysia, Borneo. They would invade Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Guam, many other Pacific islands, and were now threatening the borders of India and the borders of Australia. It was clear by now that Japan and Germany were both eager to expand and destroy the Allies, and the Americans couldn't just let that happen anymore. But there was a slight problem in their plan. The Americans really wanted to send aid to the Soviets to help them defeat Germany, but the British and French were like, hell no. It was a real awkward problem. So the Americans decided to just not send aid to the Soviets, which would cause some consequences in the future. Winter was gone, meaning the Germans could get back to business, but Hitler had a new strategy. He wanted to focus on the south. With Romanian help, the Germans would breeze through the Caucasus, taking a good amount of oil, although it was destroyed because of the British. The Germans would reach the Caspian Sea, cutting the Soviets in two. In North Africa, the Americans would land in Morocco, barely defended by any Axis forces. Slowly but surely, the Axis would be squeezed out of Africa, eventually getting 200,000 encircled in Tunisia. After that, the Allies would begin their advance into Europe, landing in Italy and Spain. They would take all of Sicily, and in Spain they would easily breeze through, liberating Spain and Portugal, reinstalling their democratic governments. German defenses would be impossible to break in the mountains, so sadly for the Allies, they weren't able to advance into France from there. Back in Italy, the Allies would slowly advance in Naples, getting pretty close to Rome. At this point, the Italians were like, I'm out. Italy would surrender to the Allies after overthrowing their fascist government. Hitler would see this and be like, I miss the old Italy, straight from the Go Italy, and would go ahead and invade them, reinstalling Mussolini. On the Eastern Front, Moscow would become a back and forth. The Germans and Soviets would repeatedly take the city from each other. But finally, for one final time, the Soviets would take back Moscow. From this point forward, the Germans would be pushed back by the Soviets. They would be able to reattach themselves back to the Caucasus and would even end the siege of Leningrad by reaching the city. The only problem for the Soviets was the British taking the southern Caucasus. In Italy, Rome would finally be taken. In France, the Allies would land in the north during D-Day, and later in the south. They would be able to easily take France. The Germans would fall back to the Rhine, holding a sturdy defense. In the east, the Soviets would breeze through, reclaiming the Baltics, Ukraine, and even making Finland surrender. The Allies were getting worried about that. They couldn't let the Soviets invade all of Eastern Europe, so they came up with a plan: make Germany surrender to them first. The Allies would demand Germany's surrender or else. But knowing Hitler, he said no. There was only one choice for the Allies. On December 23, 1944, the first ever nuclear bomb would be used in war. Berlin would be turned to rubble. And on the 25th, Hamburg would follow the same fate. Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania would all surrender to the Allies days after the nukes dropped. Hitler would be overthrown, and Germany would follow suit as well, surrendering to the Allies. Allied forces would rush to the Eastern Front, meeting head-on with the Soviets. In Japan, they were also being slowly pushed back. Fast forward a bit, it was time for Japan to face the same fate. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima would be nuked. On the 9th, Nagasaki. Japan would surrender, getting occupied by the Allies. The Axis is dead, meaning this is only an Allies versus Soviets war now. And honestly, the Allies didn't want to fight anymore, but they also didn't want the Soviet Union to be a thing anymore. So they would do the same thing they did with Japan and Germany: demand they surrender. And once the Soviets denied their demands, it was time for one final bombing. Moscow would be the final city to be nuked in World War II. Stalin would be assassinated a few days later, and a few days after that, the Soviet Union would surrender. There would be multiple treaties of World War II, but the main ones would be signed in early 1947, finalizing the borders of Europe and Asia. Germany would be carved up. Never again would it be as huge as it was a few years ago. This scenario was pretty damn crazy. The idea was made by Belgian Waffles on Discord. If you have any ideas or scenarios you want to share with me, hit me up there. But other than that, like the video, subscribe, comment, and check out my other vids. See ya!